The wagon groaned and shuddered as it climbed the narrow mountain road. Clara sat perched on the hard wooden bench, her hands gripping a small cloth bundle on her lap. Her fingers felt numb from the cold, and her dress, a plain gray woolen thing, stuck to her skin, damp from the morning mist. She had left the village before dawn, her uncle's stern words echoing in her head. "You will work off the debts. You will not return until it is done." He had handed her over to the driver like a parcel, turning away before she could even say goodbye. The road twisted and climbed, cutting through endless rows of black pines. Gray fog hung low between the trunks, swallowing the trail behind them and hiding any hint of the world she knew. When the wagon finally stopped, Clara looked up. The building ahead loomed in the clearing like a dark spine, tall and narrow, built from dark timber that seemed to drink the weak morning light. A single chimney bled thin smoke into the pale sky, and the yard lay empty except for a few crates and a broken cart leaning on its side. The driver jumped down first, barely glancing at her. "Go on," he muttered, jerking his chin toward the workshop. Clara hesitated, clutching her bundle tighter. Her feet felt heavy as she stepped down, the cold mud sucking at her thin shoes. The driver turned the horse without another word. The wagon rattled away down the path, its creaks fading into the fog. Clara stood alone now, her breath curling from her lips in thin white ribbons. She glanced at the heavy wooden door. The entire structure looked as though it had been carved out of the mountain itself, dark, unyielding, silent. Suddenly the door creaked open. A man appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long black coat buttoned to the neck. His hair was dark and combed flat against his skull, his pale face sharp and narrow, as if carved from ice. "Clara?" he called, his voice deep and echoing in the yard. She nodded quickly, her mouth too dry to form a reply. "Come inside," he ordered, stepping aside. She shuffled forward, each step sinking into the mud. As she passed him, she felt his gaze slide over her, cold and measuring. Inside, the hallway was dim and narrow, lit only by a single oil lamp that hissed quietly. The air smelled of wool, ash, and something else, something metallic and sharp beneath it all. "Leave your bundle here," the man said, pointing to a low bench against the wall. Clara set it down, her fingers reluctant to let go. He watched her, his thin lips tightening. "I am Mr. Holt," he announced. "You are here to work. You will speak only when spoken to. You will not leave the grounds. You will not send or receive letters. If you follow these rules, there will be no trouble." Clara nodded again, her head bobbing quickly. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it. Mr. Holt turned and began walking down the hallway without waiting for her. She followed, her eyes flicking over the walls lined with heavy wooden doors. Each door was shut tight, some with thick iron latches. At the end of the hall, he pushed open a heavy door and stepped into a large workroom. Long wooden tables stood in neat rows, each covered in cloth, spools of thread, and sewing tools. In the far corner, she saw a small iron stove with a weak fire glowing inside. A few workers moved silently between the tables, shadows hunched over their tasks, their faces pale and pinched in the dim light. None of them looked up as Clara entered. Mr. Holt gestured to an empty table near the window. "This will be your station," he said. "Marta will show you your duties. You will work from dawn until the bell at dusk. You will eat here. You will sleep upstairs." Clara's gaze slid to the window. The glass was warped and cloudy, but she could just make out the tops of the pines beyond. "Do you understand?" She turned back to Mr. Holt and nodded. "Good." He watched her for another long moment, then turned and left the room, the door shutting behind him with a low, final thud. Clara stood at the table, her hands hovering above the worn surface. Around her, the workers continued their quiet rhythm, as if she didn't exist at all. She glanced once more at the window. The fog pressed against the glass, gray and endless. She took a shallow breath, her shoulders sinking. I have nowhere else to go, she thought. I must endure. Then, slowly, she sat down and placed her trembling hands on the table, ready to begin. The morning bell rang with a dull metallic clang that echoed through the workshop like a funeral chime. Clara jerked upright at her table, her eyes wide and unfocused. She had barely slept the night before, the strange new shadows of the house creeping into her dreams, pulling her deeper into exhaustion. Marta shuffled into the workshop a few minutes after the bell, carrying a small tin pitcher and a basket of hard, dry bread. Her face was ashen and lined, her movements slow and mechanical. She set the basket down on a side table without looking at anyone. Clara watched her from her corner. The older woman's eyes flickered once to Clara's, and in that brief moment Clara thought she saw something. Pity, maybe, or fear so deep it had turned to stone. Marta turned away quickly, busying herself with the pitcher. "Eat before the next bell," she said, her voice flat and hoarse, as though unused to speech. Clara stood, her knees weak beneath her. She crossed to the side table and took a piece of bread. It crumbled in her hand, leaving fine dust on her fingertips. She glanced around the room as she chewed. The other workers, 4 of them, 2 older women and 2 young men, kept their heads down, moving slowly, almost ghost-like. No one spoke. In the far corner, she noticed the silent young apprentice for the first time. He was lean and pale, his dark hair hanging into his eyes as he hunched over a small sewing frame. His hands moved quickly but carefully, his shoulders tense. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up suddenly. Their eyes met across the room. Clara froze, the bread halfway to her mouth. His eyes were bright, startling in their intensity. Not empty like the others, but alive with something she couldn't name. A second later he dropped his gaze back to his work. Clara felt her throat tighten. She turned back to her table and sat down, her mind spinning. A sharp knock on the door snapped her attention forward. Mr. Holt entered, his coat buttoned to the neck as always, his thin lips pressed into a hard line. His eyes swept the room, pausing on each worker in turn. When his gaze fell on Clara, she felt her stomach twist. "You," he barked. "Follow me." Clara stood so quickly her chair scraped across the floor, the sound harsh in the silent room. She set down her bread and wiped her trembling hands on her skirt. Mr. Holt turned and left without another word. Clara followed him into the narrow hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. They passed several closed doors, each one identical, their iron latches glinting faintly in the dim light. At the end of the hall, he stopped at a small office, motioning her inside. The room was cramped, lined with shelves stacked high with fabric bolts and boxes labeled in careful script. A narrow desk stood beneath the window, covered in papers and ledgers. Mr. Holt closed the door behind them and stepped forward, looming over her. "You will work hard," he said, his voice low and cutting. "You will not speak to the others. You will not question me or Marta. If I hear otherwise, there will be consequences." Clara swallowed hard, her nails digging into her palms. "Yes, sir," she managed to whisper. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Then, abruptly, he turned to the desk, pulling a small bundle of cloth from a drawer. He shoved it into her hands. "Finish this by nightfall," he ordered. "Any mistakes will be corrected harshly." Clara nodded, clutching the bundle to her chest. Mr. Holt stepped closer again, lowering his voice further. "Your uncle owes more than you know. You should be grateful I took you in." Clara flinched as if struck. She nodded again, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Holt's mouth curled into something that might have been a smile, though it held no warmth at all. He stepped back and opened the door, gesturing her out. She hurried into the hallway, her head bowed. As she passed the workroom, she caught a glimpse of the young apprentice watching her. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before he dropped his gaze again. She slipped back to her table, her hands shaking so badly she could barely set the bundle down. Around her, the others continued their work as though nothing had happened, their eyes fixed to their tasks, their faces blank. Clara pressed her forehead to the table for a moment, trying to steady her breath. When she finally looked up, she saw Marta in the doorway, watching her with an expression that hovered between sorrow and resignation. Then, silently, Marta turned and disappeared into the hallway. Clara pulled the cloth bundle closer and forced her fingers to move. The needle felt heavy and foreign in her hand, but she pushed forward, her mind echoing with Mr. Holt's words. Grateful, grateful to be here. She bent over her work, the weight of the silent room pressing down on her shoulders like a shroud. The days blurred into each other, stitched together by the hiss of oil lamps and the slow, hypnotic rhythm of needle and thread. Clara rose before dawn each morning to the clang of the bell, her body stiff and aching from the hard, narrow bed upstairs. Marta brought thin porridge and hard bread each morning, moving like a shadow through the room. Clara tried to catch her eye once or twice, but Marta always turned away quickly, as if even a glance might crack something fragile inside her. The other workers remained silent, their faces pale and distant, their eyes fixed on their tasks. They seemed more like ghosts than people, floating through the gray air of the workshop, bound to their tables by invisible chains. Clara worked steadily, her fingers growing raw and calloused. She learned the patterns quickly, the movements becoming mechanical in her hands, but each stitch felt like another link in the chain tightening around her. She caught glimpses of Eli, the young apprentice, each day. He moved differently from the others, quieter somehow, but with small, quick motions that suggested life still sparked inside him. Sometimes she felt his gaze on her across the room. Once she dared to look up and found his eyes already waiting. For a moment the world seemed to pause, the murmur of thread and fabric falling away. Then he looked down again, bending over his frame, his hair falling forward to hide his face. One evening, after the last bell, Clara lingered at her table, her fingers tracing the edge of her work. Marta passed behind her, gathering scraps of thread and discarded cloth. Clara opened her mouth to speak, her heart hammering. "Marta," she whispered, her voice cracking in the silent room. Marta froze, her shoulders stiffening. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes wide with alarm. "Please," Clara said, her voice barely a breath. "Why do they cry at night? Who are they?" Marta's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes darted to the doorway as if expecting Mr. Holt to appear at any moment. "Marta, please," Clara tried again, desperation creeping into her voice. "What is happening here?" Marta's hands trembled as she clutched the scraps to her chest. Her mouth worked silently, but her eyes filled with a sudden raw grief. "Silence," she finally managed to croak. "You must not ask. You must not know." Before Clara could reply, Marta turned and fled down the hall, her footsteps sharp and uneven. Clara sat back heavily, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her gaze drifted to Eli, who stood at his table, frozen. Slowly he raised his head. Their eyes met again, and this time she saw it clearly. A flicker of fear and something else. A question. A door slammed somewhere in the building, and Eli jerked his head down, his fingers resuming their rapid, careful movements. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked around the room, the bent backs, the silent hands, the heavy air. That night, in her small room under the slanted roof, Clara lay awake long after the oil lamp had gone out. The wind rattled the window pane, carrying the faintest echoes of muffled cries from somewhere deep in the building. She pressed her palms over her ears, but the sound crawled under her skin, seeping into her bones. Her mind drifted to Eli, to Marta's trembling voice, to the endless rules and locked doors. She thought of home, of her uncle's rough voice, the small hearth in the corner, the smell of bread baking. But it felt like a story she had read long ago rather than something she had lived. Clara rolled onto her side, her fingers curling into fists against the thin blanket. "I will not vanish here," she thought, her jaw tightening. "I will not become another ghost behind these doors." But in the dark, her determination flickered, small and fragile. Somewhere beneath the floor, a floorboard creaked softly, as if someone moved below her. Clara froze, her breath caught. She strained to hear a shuffling step, then another. A shadow passed across the thin line of moonlight on her wall. Then silence. Clara lay still for a long time, her pulse loud and hot in her head. Finally she shut her eyes, though sleep stayed far away, hovering just beyond the edge of her mind. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, the sky a low blanket pressing down on the pines beyond the window. Clara's eyes felt raw, her head heavy from the restless night. She dressed slowly, each movement stiff and careful. Her hands trembled as she pinned her hair. She paused once, her fingers brushing the bruised hollows beneath her eyes. Downstairs, the workshop felt colder than usual. The oil lamps burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the tables. The air smelled of damp wool and ash. Clara took her place at her station, her fingers hovering over the cloth. Across the room, Eli sat hunched, his eyes locked on his work. Marta moved between tables, her shoulders hunched tighter than ever. The morning dragged on in silence. The only sounds were the muted snips of scissors, the whisper of thread through fabric, and the occasional low creak of the floorboards above. Around midday, Clara's needle slipped, snagging on a delicate seam. The fabric tore slightly, a thin split spreading under her fingers. Her heart lurched into her throat. She looked down at the small tear, her breath quickening. A sudden sharp clack of boots on the floor snapped her head up. Mr. Holt stood in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room like a blade. His gaze landed on Clara. She felt the blood drain from her face. He moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing against the wooden floor. The other workers kept their heads down, their hands moving even faster as if to disappear into their tasks. When he reached her table, he seized the torn fabric from her hands. His fingers were ice-cold, his nails sharp against her skin. "This," he hissed, holding the tear up for her to see, "is carelessness." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Her tongue felt heavy, her throat tight as a noose. Mr. Holt's pale eyes locked on hers, and for a long, terrifying moment the entire room seemed to shrink around them. "You are here because you are worthless to anyone else," he said, his voice low and thick with venom. "I have given you shelter, work, a chance to repay your family's debts. And this is how you show gratitude?" Clara's hands twitched at her sides. She shook her head weakly, but he didn't pause. He leaned closer, so close she could smell the sharp tang of ink and iron on his breath. "You will fix this tonight. You will not eat until it is perfect." He threw the fabric back onto her table, the torn seam gaping like an open wound. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, the room closing in behind him. Clara sat frozen, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Her eyes blurred, and for a moment she thought she might faint. Across the room, Eli's head was tilted slightly toward her. Though he didn't look directly, she felt his attention, a silent thread pulling between them. Marta passed behind her again. This time she paused. Out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw her hand hover in the air, trembling as if she wanted to touch Clara's shoulder. But then Marta pulled back sharply, her steps quickening as she vanished into the hallway. Clara looked down at the torn fabric. Her fingers curled over the edge, her nails digging into the threads. Worthless? Shelter? Gratitude? The words burned behind her eyes like hot coals. She forced her shaking hands to pick up the needle. The metal felt cold and heavy in her grip. Outside the window, fog pressed against the glass, swallowing the pale outlines of the trees. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her mind echoing with the cries she had heard at night, the shuffle of steps beneath her room, Eli's hidden glances. She leaned forward over her work, her breath shallow and uneven. A small, sharp voice whispered in her mind, "You are not nothing. You do not belong to him." Her hands moved slowly at first, then faster. Each stitch pulled tight against the fabric, her resolve knotting in her chest with every pass of the needle. As the light in the room dimmed toward evening, her arms ached and her vision blurred, but she didn't stop. Somewhere behind her she heard the bell ring for supper. She kept sewing. When she finally paused, her fingers cramped and bloody, she realized she hadn't cried at all. She looked at the nearly mended seam, then let her head fall forward, her forehead resting against the rough wooden table. In the dim light, her breath came slow and steady, each exhale a small act of defiance. Clara worked through the night, her stitches tightening and slipping as exhaustion tugged at her eyelids. Every so often she shook her head sharply to stay awake, her vision swaying between focus and darkness. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept into the workshop, her hands were raw and numb. She set the finished piece down, her fingers trembling violently. A wave of nausea rolled through her, and she pressed her palms flat on the table to steady herself. She turned her head slowly and looked out the window. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the tops of the pines like jagged black teeth against a gray sky. The bell rang, sharp and jarring in the early silence. Clara forced herself upright. Every joint screamed as she moved, her shoulders hunched and her arms heavy as iron. She carried the garment carefully to a side table and laid it there, smoothing the fabric with her shaking palms. Behind her she heard slow steps, heavy, deliberate. She turned to find Mr. Holt standing in the doorway, his dark coat buttoned tight, his pale face even harder in the morning light. His eyes dropped to the garment, then flicked up to meet hers. For a long, crushing moment he said nothing. Then, with a sudden motion, he snatched the piece from the table and examined it, turning it over, running his fingers along each seam. Clara's breath caught in her chest, her eyes fixed on his hands. Finally, he set it down again, his fingers curling into the fabric one last time. "You managed," he said, his voice low and almost bored. "Barely." Clara swallowed, her throat dry as dust. Mr. Holt stepped forward, his face inches from hers. His breath was cold, carrying the faint scent of old ink and wool. "You will remember," he whispered. "A mistake is a debt. A debt must be paid." Clara nodded weakly, her head dipping down. He straightened abruptly and turned away, leaving the room without another word. His footsteps echoed down the hallway like the ticking of a distant clock. Clara sagged against the table, her breath rushing out in a shuddering gasp. After a moment she forced herself to stand again. She moved to her station and sat heavily, her arms hanging limp at her sides. The other workers trickled in quietly. No one looked at her, but she felt their silent awareness, their shared dread pulsing under the surface like a second heartbeat. Marta appeared with the morning bread and a small pot of weak tea. She set a piece in front of Clara without meeting her eyes. Clara stared at it, her stomach twisting. Slowly she broke off a piece and brought it to her lips. The dry crumbs stuck to her tongue, but she chewed and swallowed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Eli moving between the tables, carrying a tray of folded cloth. Their eyes met briefly. His gaze dropped quickly, but not before she saw it. the flicker of pain, and something else, resolve. She wanted to hold that look, to let it root in her chest like a hidden ember, but he turned away, disappearing into the far end of the room. Clara's hands twitched around her bread. She set it down and pressed her palms together, trying to steady the shaking. A sharp clang at the back door startled her. She turned in time to see Mr. Holt disappear outside, his coat trailing behind him like a black shadow. Marta shuffled closer, her eyes darting to the door, then to Clara. "Eat," she whispered sharply, almost a plea. "You must keep your strength." Clara swallowed hard and nodded. Marta lingered a second longer, her fingers brushing lightly against Clara's wrist. So fast and gentle it felt like a ghost's touch. Then she pulled back and returned to her tasks. Clara sat in silence, listening to the soft clicks of scissors, the creak of chairs, the low hiss of the lamps. She felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, thick and choking, but beneath it something else pulsed now. A thin, stubborn thread of defiance, fragile but unmistakable. She picked up her needle and cloth again. Her fingers trembled at first, but soon fell into rhythm, moving with a new, quiet determination. Above her the gray light continued to rise, slow and uncertain. Clara didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since she arrived, she let herself imagine it might not end in silence. The workshop settled into its usual hush after the morning meal. The only sounds, the slow snip of shears and the steady whisper of thread sliding through cloth. Clara bent over her work, her eyes raw from lack of sleep, her fingers moving out of habit rather than thought. Every so often she glanced toward the back of the room. Eli moved with quiet precision, folding fabric and fetching tools, always avoiding Mr. Holt's gaze. But once or twice she caught him watching her from beneath his dark hair, quick glances that sparked something restless in her chest. Mr. Holt returned around midday, his coat damp with fog. He moved through the workshop slowly, inspecting each table with sharp, impatient eyes. The workers shrank into themselves as he passed, their heads lowering even further over their tasks. When he reached Clara's station, he stopped. His pale fingers drummed once on her table before sliding over her stitches. "Better," he muttered, though his mouth twisted in clear displeasure. "Still sloppy edges. You will fix them tonight." Clara nodded quickly, her throat tight. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a soft, cutting whisper. "I will not tolerate weakness. You think your family's debt is a small thing? You think you can escape it with one good seam?" Her breath stuttered. She shook her head, but the movement was so small she wasn't sure he even noticed. He straightened abruptly, his coat brushing her shoulder as he turned away. Clara clenched her hands under the table, her nails biting into her palms. Across the room, Eli's eyes met hers again, this time longer. His gaze seemed to ask her something, or warn her. She didn't know. She only knew her pulse jumped painfully under her skin. After Mr. Holt left the room, the tension eased slightly. Marta shuffled in soon after, carrying a stack of new linen. As she passed Clara's table, she paused, her eyes flicking once to Clara's bruised wrist. Their gazes locked. Clara felt the silent question tremble in the air between them. How much longer? Marta looked away quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. That evening, as the final bell rang and the other workers began clearing their tables, Clara stayed behind, her hands moving automatically over the cloth Mr. Holt had demanded she correct. The room emptied slowly. Marta stood near the door, wringing her hands. Eli hovered by the far wall, fiddling with a basket of tools. When Marta finally left, Eli remained for a few breaths longer. Clara kept her eyes low, but she felt him move closer. A soft scrape on the floor made her glance up. Eli stood a few feet from her table, his expression tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence pulsed, heavy and electric. Then Eli shifted slightly, and in one quick, furtive motion he set a small piece of bread on the edge of her table. Before she could react, he turned and slipped out the door, disappearing into the hallway like a ghost. Clara stared at the bread. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening until she thought she might choke. She reached for it with trembling fingers, holding it close to her chest as if it were something precious and fragile. She didn't eat it immediately. Instead, she cradled it in her hands, the warmth of the gesture sinking into her bones. That night, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, she felt something different inside her. A tiny glow that pushed back the darkness, clinging to the walls. In her room, she sat on the edge of her cot and finally took a small bite of the bread. It tasted rough and stale, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever eaten. She thought of Eli's eyes, of Marta's trembling hand, of the muffled cries at night. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the echo of her heartbeat under her palm. Somewhere in the black corridors of the workshop there was still warmth, still risk, still the possibility of escape. Clara set the remaining bread on the tiny shelf by her bed and curled up under her thin blanket. For the first time since arriving, her eyes closed without tears. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but as she drifted toward sleep, she clung to a single, stubborn thought. I am not alone. Clara woke before the bell, her eyes snapping open to the pale gray glow that seeped through the warped window above her bed. For a moment she lay still, listening to the deep hush of the house. The usual creaks and distant clinks seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing over the piece of bread Eli had left her. It felt like a talisman, small and rough, but warm against her palm. When the bell finally rang, she stood, her body heavy with aches. She dressed quickly, tucking the remaining bread into her pocket. As she slipped into the hallway, she felt the walls lean close, listening. Down in the workshop, the air was sharp and damp. Marta moved quietly between the tables, setting out the coarse morning bread and the thin tea. Her face looked more hollow than usual, her eyes darting to the door every few moments. Clara took her seat, her fingers twitching over the fabric in front of her. Across the room, Eli bent over his frame, his hands moving in quick, practiced motions. When he looked up, their eyes locked. Clara felt the room fade around them, the cold and silence falling away for a single trembling moment. Then Marta's sharp intake of breath snapped them both back. Mr. Holt had appeared in the doorway, his dark coat hanging like a shadow from his thin frame. His eyes swept the room, pausing for a long moment on Clara and Eli. Clara felt her stomach twist. She dropped her gaze quickly, her breath catching. Mr. Holt stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor like hammer blows. He stopped by Eli's table, leaning over to inspect his work. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he straightened slowly, his hand coming down hard on Eli's shoulder. "You," he said, his voice low and sharp as a blade, "with me." Eli stiffened, but he did not resist. He stood slowly, his face pale, his eyes flicking once to Clara before dropping to the floor. Mr. Holt pushed him forward roughly, guiding him out of the workshop and into the hall. The door closed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in Clara's skull. The room fell into an even deeper hush. The other workers kept their heads low, their fingers moving faster, as if they might vanish into their stitches. Clara sat frozen, her own hands limp in her lap. The air felt thick, her lungs struggling to pull in each breath. Marta moved past her table, her hand hovering as if she wanted to reach out. But she pulled back quickly and kept walking. Clara forced her hands to move, picking up her needle and pulling it through the cloth, though her eyes saw nothing. Every movement felt distant, as if she watched herself from far away. Time stretched and twisted, the day crawling past in heavy, choking minutes. Each small sound in the hallway made her flinch. Each creak of the floorboards sent her heart pounding into her throat. Finally, as the last light of day began to fade, the door opened again. Mr. Holt stepped inside alone. His coat was slightly askew, his hair damp with sweat. He scanned the room, his lips curling into a thin, cold smile. "Return to your quarters," he said. "Now." The workers filed out quickly, heads bowed, hands trembling. Marta stayed near the doorway, her face gray and drawn. Clara rose last, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. She moved toward the door, her mind roaring with questions she dared not speak aloud. As she passed Marta, the older woman caught her wrist suddenly, her grip surprisingly strong. Clara turned, startled. Marta's eyes glistened, her mouth working silently. Then she pressed something small and folded into Clara's palm and pushed her forward. Clara clutched it tightly, hiding it in her sleeve as she stumbled up the stairs to her narrow room. Once inside, she shut the door and slid to the floor, her back pressed against the wood. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the folded scrap of cloth Marta had given her. Inside, a scrap of linen with small, careful stitches. "Trust Eli. Tomorrow." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. For a long time she sat there, the note clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks in silent rivers. When she finally crawled to her bed, she tucked the linen under her pillow. Her mind raced with images of Eli, Marta, the dark halls, the locked doors. But beneath the fear, something bright flickered and refused to die. Tomorrow. Clara barely slept that night. She lay on her narrow cot, staring at the dark lines in the ceiling boards, listening to every creak and breath of the house around her. The scrap of linen with Marta's message lay under her pillow, the words, "Trust Eli. Tomorrow," burning into her mind like a brand. When her eyelids finally drooped, she slipped into a restless dream. Shadows moving through long halls, muffled cries behind locked doors, Eli's eyes, bright and afraid, urging her forward. At dawn, she woke with a jolt, her heart thudding. Pale gray light filtered through the warped window, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the chill of the room, the distant clang of the morning bell, and the ache in her hands dragged her back. She dressed in silence, her fingers moving clumsily. She slipped the linen scrap into her pocket, pressing it flat against her hip, as if it might vanish if she didn't hold it close. Downstairs, the workshop felt different, thinner, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Marta moved quietly between tables, her eyes flicking toward Clara every few moments, quick and nervous. Eli wasn't there. His table sat empty, a small folded cloth still resting on the edge where he had left it. Clara took her place, her hands trembling as she picked up her needle. Every stitch felt heavy, each breath measured and sharp. The morning dragged on, the silence gnawing at her skin. At midday, Mr. Holt appeared, moving through the workshop like a hawk among mice. His eyes scanned each worker, his mouth set in a thin, straight line. When he reached Eli's table, he paused, his fingers brushing the abandoned cloth. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, her pulse hammering in her throat. After a moment, he turned and left without a word. The room seemed to exhale when he disappeared, the tension releasing in a slow, shuddering wave. Marta shuffled past Clara's table, her hand brushing lightly against Clara's sleeve. Clara looked up, their eyes locking for a fleeting heartbeat. Marta's lips moved soundlessly. "Tonight?" Clara nodded once, so small it was barely more than a tremor. The hours until dusk felt endless. Clara forced her hands to work, though her stitches blurred in her vision. Her mind raced, twisting through possibilities and fears, each one sharper than the last. Finally, as the last bell rang, the workers filed out in their silent line. Clara lingered, her eyes darting to the hallway. Marta hovered near the door, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. When the room emptied, she stepped forward quickly, her voice low and shaking. "At first light," Marta whispered. "Eli will wait by the weaving shed. You must go quickly. The gate will be unlatched. Do not look back." Clara's breath caught. She nodded, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. Marta squeezed her hand once, her grip cold and strong. Then she turned and hurried away, her steps sharp against the floorboards. Clara stood alone in the workshop, the shadows creeping across the walls as the last light of day slipped away. Slowly she gathered her few things, a scrap of bread, the linen message, her thimble, and tucked them into her apron. When she climbed the stairs to her room, each step felt like it echoed for miles. She shut the door softly behind her and leaned against it, her heart a frantic drumbeat beneath her ribs. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. The yard below was dark, the workshop casting long, crooked shadows across the mud. Beyond it, the weaving shed stood hunched and silent, half swallowed by fog. She closed her eyes and pictured Eli waiting, his thin frame tense and watchful. As the night deepened, Clara sat on her cot, clutching the linen scrap. She replayed Marta's words over and over. "Do not look back." Hours crawled past. The house shifted and groaned around her, each sound sharp as a knife. When the first pale fingers of dawn crept over the pines, Clara stood. Her legs trembled under her, but she forced them forward. She tucked the linen inside her dress, smoothed her hair with shaking hands, and moved toward the door. Her fingers hovered over the latch. "Do not look back." She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her breath held tight in her chest. Clara moved down the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold boards. Each step felt like a heartbeat, echoing through her whole body. The house was dark and hushed, the lamps extinguished, the air thick with that heavy silence before dawn. At the bottom of the stairs she paused, her hand on the wall to steady herself. She listened. No footsteps, no doors creaking, no sign of Mr. Holt. She slipped across the main hall, the familiar smell of wool and ash wrapping around her like a final suffocating cloak. When she reached the side door, her fingers fumbled at the latch. For a terrible moment, she thought it was stuck. Then, with a small shiver of metal, it swung open. Cold air slapped her face. Clara sucked in a sharp breath, the shock of it clearing her mind for a fleeting second. She stepped into the yard. The mud squelched under her feet, clinging to her skirts. A thin fog crawled across the ground, coiling around her ankles and rising in ghostly wisps. She turned her eyes toward the weaving shed. It loomed at the far edge of the yard, its roof slanting sharply, half swallowed by morning mist. She began to run, her steps quick and awkward on the uneven ground. Her breath burst out in white clouds. Each heartbeat felt as loud as a drum. Halfway across she saw him. Eli stood just beyond the shed, his thin frame stiff and tense. His eyes locked onto hers immediately. In that moment, the world seemed to sharpen around them, as though every sound and movement had been waiting for this single, silent meeting. When she reached him, she nearly collapsed. Eli caught her by the arms, steadying her. His hands were warm and rough, grounding her in a way she hadn't known she needed. "Come," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, the single word barely a breath. He guided her around the shed to a small gap in the fence, 2 planks loosened and pushed aside just enough for a person to slip through. Clara paused, glancing back at the workshop. The dark windows stared back like blind eyes. "Don't look," Eli hissed, his fingers tightening on her wrist. "We must go." She turned to him, her breath shivering on her lips. For a moment she wanted to ask him what would happen to Marta, what would happen to him. But his eyes told her everything. There was no time. Clara slipped through the fence first, the boards scraping her shoulders. Eli followed, pushing the planks back into place as best he could. Beyond the fence, a narrow footpath twisted into the forest, already shrouded in thick gray mist. Eli grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. They ran. The path bent sharply, climbing over roots and rocks slick with dew. Branches clawed at her face and arms, snagging in her hair. Her lungs burned, and every step felt like her legs might give out. But Eli never let go. His grip held her upright, pulling her forward every time she stumbled. Behind them, the yard remained silent. For a terrifying moment, Clara thought maybe they had truly escaped. Maybe it was really that simple. Then a distant shout. Clara's heart stopped. She glanced over her shoulder, and in the faint haze of dawn she saw a dark shape at the fence. Mr. Holt. He shouted again, the sound ragged and furious, echoing between the trees. "Run!" Eli gasped, yanking her forward so hard she nearly fell. They plunged deeper into the forest. The fog thickened, swallowing the path ahead. The ground sloped sharply downward, sending them sliding on loose stones and wet moss. Clara's breath came in broken sobs. Every muscle screamed, but she forced her legs to move. Branches cracked behind them, heavy footsteps crashing closer. They reached a narrow gully choked with fallen branches. Eli leapt down first, then turned and pulled her after him. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankles and knees. Eli pulled her up again, his face pale and wild in the half-light. His lips moved, but she couldn't hear him. Only the roar of her pulse and the snapping of branches behind them. They scrambled up the far side of the gully, clawing at roots and stones. At the top, Clara dared one last look back. Mr. Holt appeared at the edge of the gully, his coat torn and his face twisted into something monstrous. His eyes locked on her, and for a split second the world narrowed to just those 2 points, his hate and her defiance. Then Eli yanked her forward and they ran again, disappearing into the gray mouth of the forest. Clara's lungs burned with each breath, sharp and ragged as if she were swallowing knives. Her hair whipped across her face, catching on twigs and sweat. She felt her heart thundering everywhere, in her ears, her throat, the raw tips of her fingers. Eli led her deeper into the trees, his hand locked around hers so tightly she thought her bones might crack. The forest pressed close on all sides, dark trunks crowding together, their branches clawing at the sky. Behind them she could still hear Mr. Holt, crashing through the underbrush like some terrible wounded animal. His shouts had turned to broken guttural roars. Eli suddenly pulled her sharply to the left, off the narrow trail and down a steep, muddy slope. They slid together, crashing through ferns and slick moss. Clara's knees slammed into hidden roots, and she bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. At the bottom of the slope, Eli didn't stop. He pushed her forward, his voice finally breaking through the roar in her head. "This way! We're close!" She forced herself upright and stumbled after him. The trees began to thin slightly, pale slices of sky visible through the canopy. They broke into a small clearing choked with fog. In the center stood an old stone marker, moss creeping up its sides, the inscription long worn away. Eli paused only long enough to catch his breath, his chest heaving. Clara looked back over her shoulder. Through the fog, she saw a flicker of dark movement on the slope above. "Eli!" she gasped, pointing. His head snapped around. Without a word, he grabbed her wrist again and pulled her past the marker toward another hidden path that curved sharply downhill. Branches tore at her dress and hair. A sharp thorn sliced across her cheek, but she barely felt it. All she could hear was Eli's ragged breathing and the thunder of Holt's boots behind them. The path dipped sharply and opened onto a narrow, rocky stream. Water rushed over slick stones, white and cold. Eli plunged in first, dragging Clara with him. The shock of the water nearly knocked her off her feet. "Stay in the stream," Eli shouted, his voice hoarse and cracking. "He'll lose our scent." They stumbled along the stream bed, the current slamming into their legs. Clara slipped and fell forward, her hands plunging into the icy water. Eli pulled her up before she could be swept away. She staggered forward, her breath coming in panicked sobs. The water climbed up her skirts, soaking her to the skin. Finally, Eli dragged her out onto the bank, both of them collapsing in a heap among the roots of an old oak. Clara curled into herself, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. Eli crouched beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder. "Clara," he panted, his forehead pressed against hers. "Listen to me. We're almost at the lower bridge. After that, there's a mill, an old one. You can hide there." She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. Her eyes searched his, wide and frantic. Eli squeezed her hand. "You can do this. You have to." A sound snapped through the trees above them, a branch cracking, a low, furious growl echoing across the stream. Eli's eyes widened. He grabbed Clara's arm and hauled her to her feet. "Go! Now!" he urged, pushing her forward. Clara ran, her legs numb and heavy, each step splashing through shallow water and slipping on slick leaves. Eli stayed close behind her, his breath harsh in the dark air. The forest began to open, a hint of a path rising ahead. Clara saw the glimmer of a low wooden bridge spanning a muddy gulch, its rails broken and sagging. As she stumbled toward it, she felt Eli's hand shove her forward with sudden, desperate force. "Run!" he shouted again. Clara sprinted onto the bridge, the boards creaking dangerously under her weight. She heard Eli crash onto it behind her. And then a roar, inhuman and close. She glanced back and saw Mr. Holt emerge from the fog, his coat torn and his face twisted with rage. He lunged onto the bridge after them, the entire structure shuddering under his weight. Clara's foot slipped on a loose plank. She nearly went down, but Eli's hand caught her arm again, steadying her. Together they reached the far side, stumbling off into the wet grass. Clara turned, her breath a broken rattle. Mr. Holt stood in the center of the bridge now, his eyes burning into her. He took another step forward, but the rotten boards gave way beneath him with a loud, cracking scream of wood. For a split second, his arms flailed, grasping at air. Then he vanished below, crashing into the dark gulch. The forest fell silent except for the echo of breaking boards and Clara's own ragged sobs. She fell to her knees, her hands gripping the wet grass. Eli collapsed beside her, his chest heaving. They looked at each other, their eyes wide, disbelieving, but they were still alive. And the mill waited beyond the next rise. For a long moment, Clara and Eli sat on the cold, wet ground, staring at the broken bridge where Mr. Holt had disappeared. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, the only sounds their shallow, ragged breaths and the slow drip of water from the trees above. Clara pressed her hands into the muddy grass, her fingers sinking deep as she tried to steady her shaking body. Her heart still pounded in her ears, the roar of it echoing through her bones. Eli turned to her, his face pale and drawn, his hair plastered to his forehead. "We have to keep moving," he rasped, his voice hoarse from shouting and running. Clara looked at him, her lips parting to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt raw and closed, her mind spinning. Eli reached out and gripped her shoulder, squeezing hard enough that she gasped. "Clara," he said, his eyes fierce despite his exhaustion. "Listen to me. The mill isn't far. We can rest there, but we have to go now before he—" Before anything else happens." She nodded, her head jerking once, twice. Finally, her legs obeyed. She pushed herself upright, her muscles protesting every movement. Eli helped her to her feet, his hand steady on her arm. Together they turned away from the shattered bridge and moved forward, deeper into the misty forest. The path beyond the bridge was little more than a deer track, winding between tangled roots and slick moss. Clara stumbled often, her feet numb from the cold water and the long chase. Each time Eli caught her, lifting her up without a word. They moved in a dazed silence, the forest swallowing their footsteps. Branches arched overhead, dripping cold water onto their necks and shoulders. Finally, the trees began to thin. Through the fog, a dark, hulking shape appeared. The old mill. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat, half relief, half fear. The mill stood on the edge of a narrow stream, its roof sagging and walls patched with moss and rot. The giant water wheel beside it was broken and still, covered in ivy and wet leaves. Eli led her to the side door, which hung crooked on one hinge. He pushed it open carefully, glancing around as if expecting to find someone inside. The interior was dark and smelled of damp wood and mildew. Long abandoned workbenches lined the walls, and piles of straw and broken crates lay scattered across the floor. Eli guided her to a corner where the wall met a pile of old sacks. Clara collapsed there, pulling her knees to her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Eli crouched in front of her, his face close, his voice low. "You're safe now," he said, though his eyes betrayed his own uncertainty. "At least for now." Clara shook her head, her fingers twisting into her skirts. "What about Marta?" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. What if someone finds her?" Eli's jaw tensed. He looked away for a moment, his eyes glinting in the thin gray light filtering through a cracked window. "Marta knew the risk," he said softly. "She wanted you to get out. She made her choice." Clara pressed her forehead to her knees, a wave of guilt and grief crashing over her. Hot tears spilled onto her skirt, soaking into the thin, torn fabric. Eli stayed close, his hand hovering over her arm, but not quite touching. After a few minutes he stood and moved toward the door, peering into the forest beyond. "We can't stay long," he murmured. "They'll come looking eventually. We'll rest, then move before nightfall. There's a road beyond the ridge. If we reach it, we might find help." Clara lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice small, lost. Eli turned back to her, his expression softening. He knelt again, reaching to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Somewhere else," he said simply. "Anywhere but back there. We'll find work, a place to hide. You'll be free." Clara stared at him, the word free echoing inside her skull like a distant bell. She forced herself to nod, her fingers flexing in her lap. Eli pressed his forehead to hers briefly, their breath mixing in the cold, damp air. Then he stood again, scanning the room for anything useful. Clara sat still, her eyes fixed on the doorway, on the pale blur of fog beyond. Her body felt heavy and fragile, but beneath the exhaustion, a small, trembling spark flickered to life. For the first time in weeks, maybe in her entire life, she had chosen her next step. And it was forward. The mill settled around them in a deep, breathless silence. Clara pressed her back against the damp wall, her head tipped back, her eyes drifting across the rotted beams and broken rafters above. She listened to Eli's quiet movements as he checked the doors and searched the room for anything they might use. Now and then, she heard the crunch of straw under his boots or the faint rattle of old tools. Outside, the fog thickened again, creeping in through every crack, making the world beyond the walls disappear. Clara drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Her soaked dress clung to her skin, and every shallow breath scraped her ribs raw. Eli returned to her side, dropping a small pile of dry straw and 2 torn burlap sacks at her feet. "It's not much," he said, his voice low and rough, "but it will keep us warm enough for now." Clara nodded, her fingers digging into the straw as she spread it beneath her. Eli sat across from her, his back against an old barrel, his chest still heaving with exhaustion. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They listened instead, to the drip of water from the roof, to the echo of distant branches shifting in the wind, to the pounding of their own hearts. Finally, Clara found her voice, thin and hesitant. "Eli, what happens after this?" He looked up sharply, as if he had been waiting for her to ask. His eyes were dark and tired, but a small, determined light still flickered there. "We move before night," he said. "Cross the ridge. Beyond it there's a main road. Traders sometimes pass through. We'll follow it south until we find a village that doesn't ask questions." Clara watched him, her gaze tracing the bruises on his arms, the torn edges of his sleeves. "Will they come after us?" she whispered. Eli hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Maybe, but Holt, he might not follow any more." The image of Holt on the broken bridge flashed in her mind. His twisted face, the final moment before the boards gave way. Clara shivered, hugging her arms tighter around herself. Eli leaned forward, reaching out carefully, his fingers brushing her wrist. She flinched at first, then let her hand fall into his. "I won't let them take you back," he said. His voice was quiet but firm, each word carved from something deeper than fear. Clara's breath trembled. She tightened her fingers around his. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching on the corner of her mouth. Eli moved closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "Rest a little," he murmured. "We'll need our strength tonight." She nodded, her eyelids already heavy. She slid down onto the straw, her body curling instinctively. Eli shifted to lie beside her, careful not to crowd her space, his hand still wrapped around hers. As she drifted toward sleep, the sounds of the mill faded into a distant hum. In the thin gray light she could still feel Eli's hand, warm, alive, steady. She thought of Marta's trembling whisper, of the silent workers, of the locked doors and muffled cries. And then she thought of tomorrow, the ridge, the road beyond. For the first time, she felt the fragile shape of freedom, as faint as a breath but real enough to chase. When her eyes finally closed, she carried that shape with her into the dark. Clara woke with a start, her body stiff and her neck aching from the cold ground. For a heartbeat, she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of damp wood and straw pressed into her mind, and she remembered the mill, the fog, Eli's hand around hers. She turned her head. Eli sat nearby, crouched by a narrow crack in the wall, peering out into the thinning mist. His shoulders were tense, his fingers wrapped tight around the handle of a broken tool, the only weapon they had managed to find. He turned when he felt her move. Their eyes met across the dim space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of all they had fled from, and all that might still come, filled the cold air between them. Clara pushed herself upright, wincing at the sharp stab of pain in her legs. Eli moved to her side quickly, offering his arm. She took it, their grip instinctive and urgent. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice low and rough with sleep. Eli nodded. "The fog is lifting. We need to reach the ridge before full daylight. After that, the road will be safer." Clara swallowed hard and stood. Her head spun, but she steadied herself against Eli's arm. Together they moved around the mill, gathering the scraps they had saved. The small piece of bread she had hidden in her pocket, the torn sacks to wrap around their shoulders. As they prepared to leave, Clara paused near the door, her hand resting against the rough wood. She turned to look at Eli, her face pale but determined. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli shook his head, his expression fierce and soft all at once. "We aren't free yet," he said. "But we will be. Together." Clara's throat tightened. She nodded once, firmly, and stepped outside. The morning air hit her like a slap, sharp, wet, filled with the smell of pine and earth. The forest stretched before them, dark trunks rising into a brightening sky. A faint path wound up the ridge, almost invisible among the roots and stones. Eli took her hand, their fingers locking tight. They started forward, moving as quietly as they could. Each step felt louder than a shout, each broken twig a warning shot echoing through the trees. Halfway up the ridge, Clara paused to catch her breath, her chest heaving. She turned to look behind them. The mill was barely visible now, a smudge of dark wood in the mist. In that moment, the full weight of what they had done settled on her. The terror, the flight, the bridge. Holt's face twisted in rage. She shivered violently. Eli moved closer, wrapping his free arm around her shoulders. "Don't look back," he murmured. "We only go forward now." Clara closed her eyes, pressing her forehead into his chest. After a moment, she exhaled, long and slow, then nodded. Together, they climbed higher. The ground became steeper, slick with moss and scattered stones. More than once, Clara's foot slipped, but Eli pulled her up each time without hesitation. At the top of the ridge, the forest broke open to a thin line of muddy track. Beyond it, the land sloped gently into a wide valley, shrouded in soft morning light. In the far distance, Clara saw small patches of cleared fields and the faint outline of a roof, a village. She felt a sharp ache bloom in her chest, something close to hope, but too fragile to name. Eli squeezed her hand. "That's the road," he said, his voice hushed, almost reverent. "Once we reach it, we can disappear." Clara nodded, her eyes locked on the distant valley. Behind them, a branch snapped. They turned together, their bodies tensing as one. A shape moved in the trees, dark and slow, like a wolf circling prey. Clara's breath caught, her fingers crushing into Eli's hand. But after a long frozen moment, the shape vanished back into the undergrowth. The forest went still again. Clara pressed her fist against her lips to stifle a sob. Eli leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths quick and shallow. "Go," he whispered. "We have to move now." Clara nodded, her whole body trembling. They stepped out onto the narrow track, the mud sucking at their worn shoes. Each step felt both terrifying and electric. The first true steps toward something beyond the endless walls and whispers, beyond Holt's voice, beyond the cold attic and the locked doors. As they started down the slope toward the valley, Clara felt the linen scrap in her pocket shift against her hip, Marta's final gift, a silent push forward. She tightened her grip on Eli's hand. "Forward!" Clara and Eli moved down the ridge, each step slow and cautious. The morning light spread across the valley below them like a fragile veil, catching in pockets of mist that drifted along the tree line. The narrow track twisted sharply, cutting between boulders slick with moss and roots that snaked across the mud like traps. Clara stumbled more than once, her weakened legs trembling under her weight. Each time Eli steadied her, his fingers pressing hard into her arm, his own breath ragged with effort. As they neared the base of the ridge, the forest thinned and opened onto a wide, muddy clearing. Beyond it lay the faint line of the road, winding through the valley like a pale ribbon. Clara stared at it, her throat tightening. It looked impossibly far, even now. The road meant freedom, but it also meant exposure, A last stretch without cover. Eli pulled her to a stop, his chest heaving. He turned to her, his face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat. "From here," he said softly, "we have to run. No more stopping, no more looking back. Can you do it?" Clara swallowed hard. Her whole body ached, her arms felt like lead, and her lungs still burned from the climb. But she met his eyes and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. A faint sound broke the quiet, a low snap from somewhere behind them, deeper in the trees. Eli's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. Without another word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. They broke into the clearing, their feet sinking into the soft mud with every stride. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she thought it might drown out the entire forest. Halfway across, she risked a glance over her shoulder. A dark figure had appeared at the edge of the trees, moving slowly, methodically, like a predator. Even at this distance, she knew. "Mr. Holt!" A broken, hunched shape now, but unmistakable. His coat flapped around his legs, and his movements were jerky, filled with animal rage. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Eli yanked her upright. "Don't look!" he shouted. "Run!" They lunged forward together. Clara's dress tore along the hem, her shoes filled with mud, but she didn't stop. The road drew closer, each step pulling it from a ghostly line into something solid and real. A scream tore through the clearing, Holt's voice, twisted and raw. Clara felt it slice across her back like a blade. She choked on a sob, but forced her legs to move. Eli's hand gripped hers, his pull fierce and unrelenting. At the edge of the clearing, the road rose up before them. Clara felt the last burst of energy surge through her, wild and burning. She stumbled onto the hard-packed earth, dragging Eli behind her. They collapsed together just beyond the ditch, rolling into a patch of tall grass. Clara twisted, gasping, and looked back. Mr. Holt stood in the center of the clearing now, swaying slightly, his hands hanging at his sides like dead weight. His face was twisted into something monstrous, a mask of hate and disbelief. He took one staggering step forward, then another. Eli pushed up beside her, grabbing a fist-sized rock from the ground. He hurled it with a broken, desperate cry. The rock struck Holt in the shoulder. He reeled, his balance slipping in the mud. For a moment, Clara saw something break in him, the last thread snapping. His knees buckled and he fell forward, crashing face first into the mud. He didn't rise again. Silence swallowed the clearing. Clara pressed both hands over her mouth, her breath tearing through her fingers. Eli dropped beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Holt's motionless form. They stayed that way for what felt like hours, the morning light sliding higher across the valley, the breeze lifting the edges of Clara's torn dress. Finally, Eli turned to her. His face softened, and he reached to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smear of mud. "It's over," he said, though the words sounded unsure, as if he didn't quite believe them himself. Clara's shoulders shook. She nodded, pressing her forehead to his, her tears mixing with the sweat and dirt between them. They clung to each other, the road beneath them real and rough, the sky above impossibly wide. When they finally pulled apart, Clara looked down the road. It stretched beyond the bend, disappearing into a patch of sunlight. Eli squeezed her hand. "Ready?" Clara took a shuddering breath. She thought of the attic, the sewing tables, Marta's trembling hands, the scrap of linen still hidden in her pocket. Then she looked at Eli, alive, real, his eyes fixed on her with something she dared to call hope. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's go." Together they stood, turned their backs to the forest, and stepped forward onto the open road. The road stretched out before them, a pale, wavering line disappearing into the morning light. Clara felt every heartbeat echo in her fingertips, in the soles of her feet pressed against the rough earth. She and Eli walked side by side, their steps uneven at first, stumbling under the weight of exhaustion and shock. But slowly, as the sun rose higher and the sky brightened above them, their pace steadied. A gentle breeze rustled the grass along the roadside, carrying the scent of damp soil and pine needles. Each breath Clara took felt new, sharp, as if she were learning to breathe all over again. They passed a small stand of birch trees, their white trunks gleaming in the light. Birds flitted between the branches, chirping tentatively, their songs fragile but certain. Clara paused for a moment, her hand drifting to the pocket of her dress. She felt the linen scrap there, Marta's final message pressed against her skin. She pulled it out and looked at it, the careful stitches spelling out a single word: trust. Her eyes blurred. She closed her fingers around it, pressing it to her chest. Eli turned to her, his brows drawn in concern. "Clara?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, her lips trembling. Slowly, she nodded. "It's nothing," she whispered, though they both knew it was everything. They kept walking. The road bent and dipped through the gentle slopes of the valley, each curve revealing a little more of the world beyond. Far ahead, Clara saw a cluster of rooftops, thin columns of smoke curling into the sky. A village, small and quiet, but alive. Clara felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she barely recognized. Hope. When they reached a fork in the road, Eli stopped. He turned to her, his hand rising to her cheek. His thumb brushed gently over her skin, leaving a streak of warmth that made her shiver. "We don't have to decide now," he said. "We can rest there first, eat, find new clothes. Then we choose where to go." Clara stared at him. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. His eyes searched hers, waiting for her answer. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she breathed. Together, a small, tired smile tugged at the corners of Eli's mouth. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. For a moment, the road, the forest, the past, all of it disappeared. There was only the warmth of his breath, the soft tremor of his hands. When they pulled apart, they turned toward the village. Clara's steps were still unsteady, her body bruised and raw. But each movement felt chosen now, every forward step a quiet rebellion against everything that had tried to break her. As they drew closer to the first cottages, she saw a woman hanging laundry in a small yard. A dog barked somewhere beyond a low fence. A man wheeled a cart down a narrow lane, whistling a soft tune. Ordinary life. Clara felt tears sting her eyes again, but she let them come. She did not hide her face this time. She let the warmth of the sun dry them as they fell. They stepped into the village together. People turned to look, their expressions curious but kind. No one shouted. No one ordered her to lower her eyes. Clara felt Eli's hand tighten around hers. She squeezed back. Ahead, an old inn stood at the corner where the road split again. A small sign swayed in the breeze above the door, painted with the image of a bird taking flight. She stopped, staring at it, her chest rising and falling in slow, deep breaths. A bird in flight! For so long she had been a shadow, a seam hidden in the dark folds of someone else's design. Now she felt the shape of herself again, fragile but whole, stitched back together by every step, every act of defiance, every small kindness she had been given. Eli looked at her, waiting. Clara turned to him and nodded, a real, full smile finally breaking across her face. "Let's go," she said, and together, hand in hand, they stepped forward, leaving the ghosts of the mountain workshop behind them in the mist.